I want to begin by really concentrating on two key aspects of the 10 points of the April thesis, which I'm sure you've all read before you came here, and which I will argue underpinned all the others, as important as the other points in the April thesis undoubtedly were. And what I want to look at really is namely the question of the provisional government and the role of the Soviets. And it's really on these two bedrock issues that the question of state power is ultimately posed. And this was the matter that really lay at the heart of the April thesis. In other words, which class was to be master as the 1917 revolution unfolded. Now, to get a clear understanding of why Lenin launched the April thesis on his return to Russia, we really need to get a certain amount of historical perspective on both these issues. So firstly, I want to look at the provisional government. For this, we really need to go back to the revolutionary year of 1905, when the Bolshevik position, kind of vis-a-vis an envisaged provisional government at that time, was first agreed or taken at the Bolshevik at the London conference of the Bolsheviks in the summer of that year. The conference was actually in East London, round Whitechapel. Now, Tsarism was wobbling very badly following its defeat in the Russian-Japanese War in 1904, but also because in its aftermath there followed a sort of great wave of unrest, really, involving strikes and demonstrations, including that of the most famous single event, really, of 1905, the massacre on Bloody Sunday in January 1905, where, who knows, somewhere between 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, a massive number of people killed outside the Winter Palace when they'd just gone along to plead with the Tsar for some relief to the kind of conditions that they were suffering from when the Cossacks just charged into them. Now, there was great expectation amongst the Bolsheviks, at their meeting in London, that a bourgeois democratic revolution was on the cards. And the key perspective here was that the Russian bourgeoisie was really too weak and supine in the face of the Tsarist autocracy to really fully carry through and complete a bourgeois revolution. In addition, it was also too fearful of what elemental forces might be unleashed by a growing Russian working class. So essentially, if Russia was to strive towards a similar system of government as existed in Western Europe and America, what the Bolsheviks believed was that could be described really as a sort of proletarian imprint or a stamp of approval would be needed in order to bring about a successful bourgeois revolution and rid Russia of Tsarism. So it was really on this basis, or to put it more crudely, introducing some working class steel to shore up the backbone of the Russian middle class, that the delegates in London agreed to participate in any provisional government that emerged in the course of 1905. Now, at this time, we also see emerging the future and deeper divisions between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, largely along the lines and for the reasons really that I've already given, namely that for the Bolsheviks, the bourgeois revolution would have to be worker-led, whereas for the Mensheviks, the more traditional, orthodox, historical formula must be followed, and that therefore it was the role of the liberal bourgeoisie to lead the bourgeois revolution, really, whether they wanted to or not, or quite frankly, whether they had any inclination to or not. So now, by leading a popular uprising from below, the Bolsheviks believed that they would gain enormous political prestige and be able to use their influence and the strength of their working class social base to further empower the Russian working class in what would still be its continuing battle with capital, while always, and I think it's important to remind ourselves of this, still remaining within the confines of capitalist property relations. No one, not even Lenin, really envisaged going beyond the bourgeois revolutionary stage of development. Well, there was one person who I'll mention at the end. The disagreement was really over the means to achieve it. In other words, really, by operating within a provisional government, the Bolshevik strategy was to play a leadership role from above, as well as that which it would be playing from below. Well, as we now know, of course, this was not to be. The collapse of the 1905 revolution meant that this perspective was never put to the test. No provisional government ever emerged during the 1905 revolution. So I just want to have a quick look really at the Soviet in 1905. And I'll just say here that before 1905, other than what I've already said about participating in a revolutionary provisional government, I haven't really found that any real depth of thought had been given by the Bolsheviks to any other significant form, really, that working class organisation might take in the process of a revolutionary upheaval. Although, of course, there was the experience of the Paris Commune some 35 years earlier, and I will come back to that in the course of the talk. So in this sense, the arrival on the historical scene of the Soviets, or workers' councils, this is where delegates are directly elected from factories, other workplaces, army regiments, and so on, were a key example of how the working class in struggle taught the so-called vanguard, in this case the Bolsheviks, but also other revolutionaries, really about the ABCs of revolutionary struggle, not the other way round. The Soviets constituted an example of the party leading the class. I can never say that phrase without Tony Cliff ringing in my ears the number of times he used to talk about the party leading the class. And really the Soviets, in that sense, sort of crystallised once again the question Marx had posed in his Thesis on Feuerbach in 1845 concerning really who teaches the teachers, or who educates the educators. Do you know that when Lenin wrote What is to be Done in 1901, he didn't even mention the Soviets once? I mean, how bad was that? I just want to say here really that he did learn, okay, that the educator did start to get educated, because once the 1905 revolution had produced the Soviets, Lenin did begin to put increasing emphasis. He saw what was going on and began to put increasing emphasis and looking upon the Soviet as the possible embryo of a provisional government. Now, this was not in the context of a dual power situation, as was to be the case in 1917, but more in the sense of the Soviets either kind of merging into a provisional government or sort of nurturing and taking responsibility for setting up such a government, but from below, from the grassroots. Now, either way, both in 1905 and right up to 1917, all social democrats, which is what Marxists called themselves at that time, envisaged a long period of struggle to overcome Tsarism, even after a revolutionary upheaval was underway, and perhaps lasting many years. And again, no Marxist at the time, Lenin included, endowed the Soviet with a separate, independent historical capability. Rather, they viewed it as a sort of transient phenomena, or the Soviets as a transient phenomena, sort of rising and falling, waxing and waning, really, as a consequence of the changing balance of class forces within the course of the wider struggle against Tsarism. So the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," would not have crossed anyone's mind in 1905, not even Lenin's. Now, we have this sort of similar sad conclusion, because as with the provisional government, all this became somewhat speculative. The 50-day St. Petersburg Soviet was dispersed forcibly by the Tsar in November of 1905, at the end of 1905, even though its legacy was not to be completely buried. The memory of it did live on. So if I just briefly skip what have been described as the muddy years for the Bolsheviks, this is the period following after 1907, when the 1905 revolution was finally ended, really, and after that there was a kind of combination of increased Tsarist oppression, the sort of retreat of working class organisation and militancy, and as a consequence, of course, the increased marginalisation of the revolutionary left. Which always, as we might know, can lead to faction fights, internal rows and disputes, people personally falling out and what have you. I won't comment anymore on that. So we can see that by the time of the First World War, the old Bolshevik policies or strategies regarding both the provisional government and the Soviets largely stood unchanged. And basically this amounted to that, if a provisional government arises in the course of the coming bourgeois revolution, join it, and possibly in the right circumstances even lead it. And as far as the Soviets or workers' councils are concerned, encourage their spread and development as part of the wider struggle from below. But again, from what I can tell, there still remained a certain amount of ambiguity and lack of clarity concerning what ultimate role they might actually play. I think in this sense they were what could be described as a sort of a known unknown. was it the Donald Rumsfeld phrase. Now, I think we can say that that by and large, in terms of the day-to-day priorities of the Bolsheviks, and at times their kind of existential fight for survival, both of these issues resided somewhere on the back burner for many years. And it wasn't really until the April Thesis and the aftermath of the February Revolution that Lenin once again kind of brought them to the fore. But to be clear on one issue, there was one issue that was never put on hold, and that was that the coming revolution would be a bourgeois democratic revolution. And for the Bolsheviks, this would be led by the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. And there was this discussion last Alex's meeting about what dictatorship actually meant here. Led hopefully by the workers and peasants. So 1914, obviously from 1914 onwards, we have, of course, the bloody catastrophe, really, of the imperialist Great War, but also the totally unexpected and deeply wounding disaster of Second International Marxism, the international that had been founded by Engels in the early 1890s, and where we see it abjectly, really, capitulating to national chauvinism, no longer raising the banner proclaiming workers of the world unite, but instead supporting their own ruling classes in the imperialist war. A part that is from the Bolsheviks, who were the only really significant section of the Second Socialist International to defy this pressure. A fact that is not unconnected to the events that occurred in 1917. So the collapse of the Second International, including the jewel in the Marxist crown, the German Socialist Party, the SPD, came as an utter shock to Lenin, and to put it mildly, demanded a massive rethink. And this is when he went back to rereading Hegel's Science of Logic with its concentration on the importance of breaks in gradualness. As he wrote in the margins of Hegel's book, gradualness explains nothing without, and he put it, leaps, leaps, leaps. And here he was really reflecting on the pervading ideology of the Second International and the negative influence of who he would later describe as the renegade Kautsky. The German Marxist Anton Pannekow described Kautsky's politics basically as actionless waiting. If Lenin was, for him it was wait, not Lenin's leaps. And it always struck me as a bit of a kind of Hamlet character. To be or not to be. With Kautsky, it was always not to be. But also, more especially, he went back to rereading Marx on the State, notably one of Marx's greatest works, really, The Civil War in France, with its emphasis on the Paris Commune. We'll keep coming back to the Paris Commune. And from where Marx drew the lesson, really, at the end of the Commune, that the working class could not simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. All this had been lost somewhat, and Lenin went back to rediscovering this stuff at the heart of Marxism. So all of this was to prove a big influence on the April Thesis and to provide the seedbed of ideas for his most famous pamphlet, The State and Revolution. I know Amy's still here. I know Amy's speaking on this at the next part of the course. So I won't say too much on it, although there is this view that you might be interested, Amy, that because it wasn't published till 1918, the State and Revolution had no influence whatsoever on the Russian Revolution. There's quite famous historians arguing that. Strikes me a bit like this stuff of, I don't know, perhaps we've got a theologian here. I can't remember when the Gospels were first written, but probably about 50 years after Jesus died. But apparently Christianity could not have existed until whoever it was, Luke or John, actually put it on paper. But you get the idea. Now, the other fact here, I think, worth noting is that even though it was quite early on, Lenin was already making his preparatory notes for State and Revolution from late 1916 and in early January 1917 in what was called the Blue Notebook, where all the stuff where. What was to be the thrust of the State and Revolution was already, the ideas were already being gathered together. He did actually lose the notebook apparently on his way back to St. Petersburg I think they had to send out a search party and look for it in Stockholm. I don't know, but anyway, I'll leave that to Amy. She's talking on State and Revolution next. So we've got all this background build-up, and really all this intellectual ferment and reassessment beavering away in Lenin's brain, for some time, so at least 2 years up to the February 1917 revolution. But then immediately we see these ideas feeding into his letters from afar, when he was still in Switzerland, which he wrote throughout March 1917. And here he's focusing much more on the concept of a revolutionary crisis and when and how to act decisively at favourable moments, not just waiting passively for the laws of, in quotes, the laws of Marxian economic determinism to clarify the situation to, really to everyone's satisfaction until all the jigsaw pieces had somehow wonderfully fitted into place. But he's practically engaging in shaping the future. We're finally there now. April the 3rd, 1917, Finland Station. Now, Lenin arrives back in Russia again on the sealed train. Always sounds like it's it's like covered in corrugated iron or something, or massive giant rolls of sellotape. I mean, all the sealed train meant was that they had diplomatic immunity. Now there is a bit of a narrative here that I've tried to show in the ISJ article is not quite as clear cut as it sometimes seems. I've tried to show that the struggle in the Bolshevik Party was a bit more protracted than sometimes is allowed for. But at times this kind of narrative can amount to really something of a parody, which goes something along the lines of that Lenin gets off the train, gives the Bolsheviks a bit of a bollocking, a bit of a dressing down. I've got an image of a football coach, I'm not going to do my Sam Allardyce impersonation, but telling them to up their game a bit, too many schoolboy errors and all that sort of stuff, and that somehow they all realise, after some initial kind of hostility and resentment, that perhaps the old boy's right. Yes, we've got a bit distracted in the aftermath of the February Revolution. Taken their eye off the ball, sorry about that one, and then very quickly respond to Lenin's wake-up call. They sort of shake off the pull of left reformism and reorientate on their original goal of overthrowing the provisional government and moving quickly towards bringing about a socialist revolution. Well, hopefully, if I've done nothing else so far, I've tried to show that the overthrow of the provisional government was not the goal of old Bolshevism. The goal of old Bolshevism was the overthrow of Tsarism, not a provisional government. So in that sense, no wonder there was confusion going on. And furthermore, until Lenin's arrival, the question of a second stage of consciously focusing on preparing for a socialist revolution was really never seriously engaged with. So what I want to try and emphasise is that the April thesis really helped to break this logjam because it recognised very quickly that the actual provisional government of February 1917 was utterly different to the one anticipated by pre-1917 Bolshevism. All the Bolsheviks, I keep saying including Lenin, I'm not quite sure why, believed a long and protracted struggle would be required to get rid of Tsarism, even after a revolutionary upheaval was underway. But when it actually came about, the collapse of Tsarism happened astonishingly quickly. And the vacuum came to be filled not by the Bolsheviks playing this sort of decisive leadership role, their perspective from above and below, and carrying through the bourgeois democratic revolution to its furthermost kind of democratic limits. But instead, power was seized by a cabal of right-wing Duma deputies, the Duma of the Russian parliament, with an inbuilt kind of capitalist landlord majority, including a fair smattering of loyal monarchists. I mean, there were no kind of no Dantons or Robespierres amongst this lot. No kind of audacity. There was 1789 did not feature here. What they wanted was to put the February Revolution back in the box as quickly as possible, and you get a flavour of that from the Cadet Party leader Milyukov. And this is what he had to say. We did not want this revolution, and we had desperately struggled so that it would not happen. Some bourgeois revolutionary there. Another leading member of the provisional government, V.V. Shulgin, said this: if we do not take power, others will take it for us. Those rotten elements who have already elected all sorts of scoundrels in the factories. And by that he meant the Soviets. So these dramatic developments really required a rapid reassessment there was now no point in dogmatically kind of maintaining a scenario that can no longer be applied. As Lenin put it, according to the old ways of thinking, the rule of the bourgeoisie could and should be followed by the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. In real life, things have already turned out differently. There has been an extremely original, novel and unprecedented interlacing of one with the other. In other words, for Lenin, the old Bolshevik perspective of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry had already occurred. Indeed, it had become a reality, but not in the way it was envisaged. And what Lenin meant by this, when he used this phrase, unprecedented interlacing of one with the other, was that the supposedly kind of official provisional government, representing the rule of the bourgeoisie, now existed side by side, alongside that of the Soviets. It was the Soviets which embodied and represented the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and poor peasantry. They had the power. For example, soldiers would only obey orders if they were countersigned by the Petrograd Military Committee, which was loyal to the Petrograd Soviet. It's order number 1 specifically said weapons are not to be given up to officers. And by the way, you don't have to salute them once you're off duty. So the Soviets were back in much greater strength and numbers than in 1905. But this time, more importantly, they were there at the very beginning of the revolution, not at the end of it. The provisional government could not enforce its own autonomous state power. If governments can't do that, they've got a problem. They couldn't enforce its own autonomous state power. It had no police, no army, no officialdom standing above the people. As I say, day-to-day power resided in the Soviets. And this is what Lenin said. This is a fact, the kind of fact that is characteristic of a state of the Paris Commune type. He keeps coming back to it. His reading of Marx and the Civil War is there all the time. It's a bit, not the best analogy in the world, but you do get the idea of this sort of safe deposit, and whenever these kind of bank vaults, have these safe deposit boxes, don't they? You have to have someone with one key and someone with another, and so on. So it's a little, not the best analogy in the world, but you do get the idea. Now Lenin was amongst the first to grasp that dual power, especially in the context of class antagonisms and class warfare by now really, is an unstable phenomenon. Either one side wins or the other. Or to put it more bluntly, one lives and one dies. And it's here that the demand for all power to the Soviets took on really such significance. Soviet power was the key to bringing about a successful socialist revolution, before really reaction could sort of regather all its forces together to come together to crush, to crush the revolution. So he's now back in Russia, and the April thesis has been launched. Still a few problems, at least 3 problems. First, to win the party over to this new position and to an acceptance that the dictatorship of the proletariat had, as he put it, already been accomplished in reality and was embodied in the Soviets. Secondly, he then had to try and argue how the importance of fighting and defeating the socialist revolutionary and Menshevik majorities in the Soviets, so as to stem and reverse the draining away of the Soviets' own de facto power, which, as I say, was seeping towards the bourgeois provisional government. So this is really a kind of a corrosive process of class collaboration going on. And this is how he put it. The problem was that the majority of the Soviets, far from wielding the power they possessed, were surrendering helplessly to petty bourgeois revolution, voluntarily ceding power to the bourgeoisie and making themselves an appendage of the bourgeoisie. And moreover, Lenin was very concerned, in fact deeply concerned, that the Bolsheviks themselves were being infected by this political slide. And this explains really why he was so hard on Lev Kamenev and other leading old Bolsheviks, who were still arguing that the bourgeois revolution had still not been completed. I mean, Kamenev was even arguing that the fight for the transference of power to the Soviet would, as he put it, disorganise the revolution. And even worse, there were a number beginning to argue that in order to defend the gains already made, the Bolsheviks would be obliged to continue support for the imperialist war, now under the guise of revolutionary defensism. In other words, keeping to the treaties and alliances that Tsarism had made with British and French imperialism. And Kamenev, it's not a personal thing on him, but someone has described him quite quite correctly, I think, as the epitome of old Bolshevism. It even went so far as to insist that soldiers and sailors remain steadfast at their posts and answer the enemy bullet for bullet and shell with shell. This is after all these years of opposing the war. So I think here we can really begin to see how maintaining the now obsolete old Bolshevik formula would in practice effectively mean condoning this continued slippage or drainage away of power from the Soviets, a process, as I say, that Lenin believed was already dangerously in train. Without the input of the April Thesis, the Bolsheviks would have remained both theoretically and organisationally ill-equipped to stand against this process, let alone be able to counteract it. And the third thing to say is that it was the April Thesis which starkly posed the question of state power. So I'll sort of come back to where I started, really, because it was the thesis that really set in motion the ultimate overthrow of the provisional government once a majority had been achieved for this purpose in the Soviets. You know, as Lenin said of the Soviets, and this is a few days after he'd arrived in Petrograd, should they take over the power, it will no longer be a state in the ordinary sense of the word. The world has seen no state power such as this functioning for any considerable length of time. And once again, he points out, this would be, our old friend, a state of the Paris Commune type. And he went on to say that no bourgeois capitalist country could tolerate such a state institution as the Soviets, and no socialist revolution could operate with any other state institution than this. So really, without the April Thesis, it is hard to see how October would have happened. And thanks. To bring this about and win the party, Lenin really had to go over the heads of the existing internal Russian leadership of the party, the old Bolsheviks, with its base in the Russian bureau of the Central Committee, and appeal to the militants who had actually played a leading role on the ground during the February Revolution, and who were increasingly really politically striving to operate as uncompromising revolutionaries. I mean, these were the people who took the initiative in the struggle for the 8-hour day, took the lead in arresting Tsarist officials, and the ones most energetic in taking up the creation of workers' militias. When he came back to Russia, Lenin was not in a position to simply call all the shots when he came back. But the April Thesis, I believe, did help to give political focus and expression to these forces that I've just described, and provide him with a social base in his fight both within the Bolshevik Party against Kamenev and Stalin, but also, more latterly, his closest comrade, Zinoviev, and eventually to amass enough support in the streets and factories and army barracks to produce a Bolshevik left SR, left social revolutionary majority of delegates in the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which was ultimately to oversee the October Revolution. Now, this majority was built by agitating, amongst a number of things, for ending the war, actively seizing landed estates, and actively replacing the police with workers' militia, the Red Guards. So they were doing in practice, really carrying out the words of Rosa Luxemburg, that the dialectic of revolutions runs not through a majority to revolutionary tactics, but through revolutionary tactics to a majority. Unfortunately, Rosa Luxemburg came a bit too late for her for that realisation. I'll just briefly summarise now. So in a sense, the April Thesis was a crystallisation or bringing together of a number of different factors, some subjective, some objective, that comes kind of simultaneously into play. The subjective included Lenin's reading and own rethinking in what amounted really to an epistemological break from Karl Kautsky and the Second International, divesting himself of his own old Bolshevism, if you like, although I will qualify that at the end. Others were more objective, and they're not really in any order of priority, but I'll list them anyway. Firstly, the unexpected nature of the February Revolution. Secondly, the deteriorating level of famine and economic dislocation that was going on throughout Russia. Thirdly, of course, the mass slaughterhouse of the Great War. who knows, the millions of Russian soldiers that were being butchered at the front. But which also, in this case, brought forward the prospect of turning the imperialist war into a civil war. Should also mention, although this is really another talk, the process of combined and uneven development. I mean, the fact that capitalism was developing rapidly in Russia, raising the prospect of a Russian revolution, not only been able to put socialism on the agenda in Russia, but also acting as a detonator for a workers' revolution throughout Europe and beyond. And again, not least, the group I've already sort of referred to, a kind of growing militant sort of critical mass, if you like, who would not accept halfway measures, and who also had at their core a Bolshevik party cadre. I'll just end really with the obligatory reference to Trotsky, but just to say first of all that it would be wrong to conclude from all I've said that old Bolshevism had nothing to recommend it whatsoever. I may have slightly overdone it. This would really be a travesty. I mean, it was a party that had a nucleus which involved, I'll say why the word nucleus is chosen in a second, a nucleus which involved a strategic view of a worker-peasant alliance, a profound internationalism, witnessed really by its refusal to capitulate, as all the other socialist parties did at the outbreak of the war. It also had deep roots in the Russian working class, and really a cadre that had been tempered in struggle, with indeed, again in spite of what I said, a number of trusted leaders at all levels. What the April Thesis did, as Trotsky noted, was to cast off the worn-out shell of Bolshevism, this sort of old formula, this tarpaulin that was covering it. It was to cast off the worn-out shell of Bolshevism in order to summon its nucleus, to life. And if this had not occurred, there would have been no October, which is the only real example of a successful workers' revolution in history. I think I'll stop.